farmers markets in neighborhoods, especially where there's food deserts. The other thing is that, beyond the four walls. So there's hospitals, many of the nonprofit hospitals in the country have what's called community benefit dollars. And that means that if in lieu of paying taxes, they're supposed to identify the needs in the community and to then address those needs with some of the money that they have. And so some of the ways in which they're doing that is now actually helping to invest in more local and sustainable producers, distributors in their community to build up their capacity, which is a way of saying that we as healthcare understand that if we can address the upstream conditions that are bringing people to the emergency room, we can actually start to move toward more preventative medicine and not just waiting for people to show up in our emergency rooms. So addressing housing, addressing food systems, addressing transportation, addressing other social and environmental determinants, especially pollution, are ways in which we can actually start to not have hospitals be the place of first resort, but the place of last resort. So we have developed this strategy where, taking that $7.8 billion that's spent on food across the healthcare sector, how can we link not just hospitals, but how can we link schools and universities and jails, municipalities, to link together their procurement standards on food? That represents $130 billion a year. And so we got together with different networks that are working on university food systems, working on municipal school food systems, and built a standard that aligns around a whole set of values, values-based purchasing, we call it. And now that standard is being piloted in Chicago with the school systems and the hospital systems and the universities to basically aggregate the power and to message to the distributors and the suppliers of healthcare is that we want value-based food systems. We don't want necessarily the cheapest food. If that means that workers are being exposed to toxic chemicals, if it means that agricultural workers in the field don't have the sufficient protections as it gets hotter and hotter, if it means that there's pesticide residues on the food that we're serving to our children and to people in hospitals. So it's idea of injecting values into the food system that we have and leveraging this enormous purchasing power of institutional markets to help drive the economy in the right direction. There are federal good food purchasing strategies that could actually, if they were mandated, could move the entire federal purchasing system toward these standards, which would have a huge impact. We have another set of initiatives that are also helping to measure the carbon footprint of the food that's bought in healthcare, so that as we move away from meat-intensive meals toward more plant-based diets, we can actually not show the carbon benefits of moving in this direction. And one of the things we've also discovered is another place of enormous climate footprint is the waste. There's so much food that's wasted in our universities, in our hospitals, our school systems. And so one of the strategies has been to partner with logistics companies that can take the waste, unused food that might be served in a hospital and bring that to nonprofits and food banks in the region so that people who are food insecure can actually access it. That both reduces the cost for disposal for the hospitals, it reduces their carbon footprint, reduces their food waste, and it addresses food insecurity. And the last thing, I know I'm coming to the end of my talk here, but it's basically saying that one of the things we learned in COVID is that some of the global supply chains for food were broken, and the national ones. And during COVID, there were many community-based food distributors who were called upon to deliver food boxes to people who are hungry. And so trying to create this kind of wealth creation in community with nonprofits, with food justice coordinated organizations that are then part of this righteous supply chain in healthcare that both builds not just the resilience of the community, but also starts to weave together a healthier food system for those communities. And finally, I'll mention that there's a lot of work happening now where we're starting to reimburse. Hospital systems and health insurers are getting behind this, is addressing food as medicine. And so if somebody is living in a neighborhood where the food is inaccessible, where it's not healthy, where there's mostly junk food available, where somebody's had some medical emergency or a heart transplant, they need some help to then continue to learn how to eat healthier so they don't come back for additional treatments. And so the idea of having prescriptions for fruits and vegetables, medically tailored meals brought to people's homes is something that is gaining enormous traction in the healthcare sector now. And so I'll stop there, but the point I'd like to end with is that we need to redesign our food systems for a climate stressed world. We need to design our food systems in a world where everyone on the planet is going to be impacted by some level of climate change impacts. And food becomes one of the crucial delivery mechanisms and solutions that we need to address for the global civilization. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Greg Sixt, is a subject expert on agricultural innovation, food and water, climate and energy nexus. He runs the FACT Alliance, which is the Food and Alliance System for Transformations at the Abdul Latif Jameel Water and Food System, GWAFS lab at MIT. It's a cohort of 30 global members and institutions working towards shortening the link between research and action, and to solve food systems and climate change and global climate challenges.
Thanks.
See if I can get this to work. This is where you all find out that I reuse my cover slide between events. So apologies if that says something else at the bottom there. But I'm going to talk a bit today about some of the work that MIT is leading. The MIT Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab is leading in addressing challenges of the nexus of food systems and climate change. So before I get started, I actually, can I move this? Let's see, hold on one second. It's right in the middle of my notes. It's fine. I'll just deal with it. No, it's the Zoom things in the middle of, I don't know how to move the screen sharing. Don't worry about it. Can't move it. No worries. I'll deal with it. So before I proceed, I think it's important to define what food systems are. They encompass everything from food production to processing, distribution, preparation, consumption of food, as well as the related socio-economic, health, and environmental outcomes. So food systems are more than just agriculture. They're also extremely complex. They're deeply embedded in culture, economics, environment, policy, and quite importantly, climate change. And because food systems are so complex and the relationship with climate change is so complex, they actually kind of make solving climate change challenges in energy and transportation seem comparatively simple. That's how complex they are. Ensuring a healthy, sustainable, and resilient food system in the era of climate change really represents one of the ultimate grand challenges we face as humans. You know, we can live without power, cars, airplanes, cell phones, which we did until quite recently, but we can't live without food and water. Another term I just kind of want to introduce here is the term social ecological systems, which is what food systems are. It's the interaction of humans and the environment and how those interactions affect society. So I'm going to go through a little bit about some of the challenges facing our food systems and ultimately kind of what's wrong with them. And then we'll talk about some of the work that MIT is doing. So what you see here, so the first problem is there's very uneven access to safe and nutritious food. This is a 1 week's food supply for a family in France on the right and a family in Chad on the left. And you can see that enormous disparity between that weekly food. Also, some of the stuff on the family in the France is not particularly healthy to Gary's point earlier. There's also 1 in 10 people in the world live without enough to eat. And I want you to take a quick look at this map here, because you're going to see the areas where there's great food insecurity is almost the photo negative of the areas where obesity and overweight exists. So almost 40% of adults in the world are overweight, and about 13% of adults in the world are obese. In the US, that figures of overweight and obese is over 70%. Food systems are the principal drivers of climate and ecological impacts. So they're responsible for about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. To put that into context, if we stopped all energy-related emissions today, the emissions from food systems would drive us past that 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius mark by the latter part of the century. So it really is, again, that grand challenge here. They're also uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So as we're starting to see with droughts and different things that come out of climate change. And also the agriculture component of food systems is responsible for about 70% of freshwater withdrawals globally. They're the key driver of biodiversity loss as well. The global food system is the primary driver of biodiversity loss, and the agriculture component is responsible for over 85% of the species at risk of extinction. So this all speaks to a need to transform food systems. President Obama's chief science advisor, John Holdren, said, this is related to climate change, we basically have 3 choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. And he went on to say, we're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation will be required and the less suffering they'll do. So we need to transform our food system. Where we are right now, with changing diets to move towards more animal-intensive diets and just a growing population in general, is causing us to have to intensify our production to meet this demand, which is making the situation worse. So the key question here and the need to transform food systems really addresses, how do we make our food systems more resilient to climate change, more sustainable, more equitable, and more nutritious? Food systems transformations need to be inclusive. It can't be top down. We have to engage people along the value chains. So there's different stakeholders throughout these different processes. So to be effective, and they must deliver on nutrition for all with reduced environmental impact and more resilience. These are some of the stakeholder groups that kind of fit into that. They need to be implementable on the ground, and they must be deliverable through policy. Now, research plays a key role in this, but there's some challenges with the current research paradigm, especially as it relates to food systems and climate change. One is that research is often narrowly focused. So food and climate systems are highly complex and interrelated, but research often occurs in these disciplinary silos, and collaborating across those silos is really difficult conventionally. I'm painting with a broad brush here. There are definitely, obviously, some groups that are doing this really well, but these are some of the challenges. It's also frequently misaligned with stakeholder needs and values. So research priorities are often inadequately informed by the needs of policymakers, decision makers in those communities impacted by climate change and by the transitions in food systems. And it's often unactionable. So it can be difficult for stakeholders to apply research outcomes. As researchers, we typically disseminate our research in peer-reviewed journals. It's a fundamentally important process for science, but there's a disconnect. Stakeholders can often have difficulty translating this research for implementation. It's a disconnect between that output and the science and the policy folks or the folks on the ground. So what this calls for is convergent research approaches. What I mean by convergence research is research that addresses vexing, complex societal challenges through collaborations across disciplines, engaging stakeholders as partners, contextualizing technology or policy interventions in the broader context of the food system, and it requires leadership. And on this image here on the left here, kind of goes through the evolution of research approaches. And this convergence research approach where we're at the top is kind of the most progress we've made so far has been in medicine, and we really haven't gotten into it too much in food systems yet. But a couple key elements is that, compared to disciplinary, multidisciplinary, compared to all the others, convergence research engages, it goes beyond academia, it involves government, political decision makers, different stakeholders, and it requires long-term commitment. So we typically kind of have these funding cycles of 3 to 5 years. And if you're doing especially kind of development work or things like that, that 5-year project cycle tends to incentivize something that's measurable at the end of that 5 years. So it incentivizes us towards these, it's easier to say we built the lined canal at the end of 5 years than to say we started the decade plus long process of systems transformation. So it requires a long-term commitment. And that's one of the messages we're really trying to get through to some of the funders as we do this. So in response to this, MIT's Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab launched the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, or the FACT Alliance. We launched at COP26 about a year and a half ago in Glasgow, Scotland. We are a global network of over 20 members representing academic and applied research institutions, and stakeholder organizations. It's an open network, so each of our members brings with them their own networks. And because we have a global reach and disciplines, and we represent the food systems disciplines along the whole value chain, we're able to engage with stakeholders on the ground, with local research institutions, with different partners at different scales. So that's that kind of the open network where it makes sense to bring in the right partners, we can. So how do we do this? We're still young, so we're just getting started on some of this stuff. And there's a lot here, so we're not going to go through all of this, right? But if you're interested, you can. I realize the look of me referring you to a paper when I just said the challenge of that. But this is a short one, and you can only read it if you want to. Otherwise, we can talk through this. But if you want to find out more about this framework, it's in this paper here. But basically, what we've got is we've got this overarching process where you start out with identifying the vulnerabilities within a given food system, within an area you're focusing your research on, or where a policy is being implemented or a funder is funding. And you engage with the stakeholders throughout that process to see what the systemic barriers and opportunities are for change, what some of the key knowledge gaps are, who the partners need to be, both research-wise and on the ground, and the different stakeholders. And that drives this longer research. This pointer's not really working. That drives this longer research process starting in 3 and 4. It starts to identify the technologies, the scalable solutions, the implementation, and also that broader, those first 2 elements that are this broader systems approach, kind of lay out the groundwork so you can evaluate against that in the future. So as I mentioned, we're quite young. So the FACT Alliance's foundational project is the Jameel Index for Food Trade and Vulnerability. It's funded by Community Jameel. It's a FACT Alliance project. It's led by MIT JWAFs, and it's got some FACT Alliance partners in here, the International Food Policy Research Institute, the Oxford Martin School, and the Ethiopian Institute for Agricultural Research. Earlier, I also mentioned that we're an open network. So in this case, we've got an external partner on this project, United Arab Emirates University. We've got a team of researchers there who are from Sudan and have a lot of deep experience in Sudan, and Sudan is going to be one of the countries in which we do our deep dive. So why trade? Well, 25% of agricultural products are traded internationally, and trade has become a key determinant of food security. So it plays this role on one side of kind of mitigating shocks and mitigating risks. At the same time, it can be a mechanism through which risk and shocks are transmitted throughout the system. So a key example is if you're Lebanon and you're getting, don't quote this number, but you're getting approximately 80% of your wheat from Ukraine and Russia, and there's a war between Ukraine and Russia, that really impacts your access to food. So that's where this trade can buffer and increase risk. And trade also touches on 6 pillars of food security. There are 6. I'm going to go through them real quick. So trade touches on 4 of the 6. So availability is the quantity, the sufficient supply. The access is the ability to pay for it. Utilization is being able to use that food to meet the positive nutritional outcomes. The sustainability side is to be able to meet those shocks. That's where that climate change element really kicks in. An agency is the individuals or groups having the capacity to independently act, choose what they grow, choose what they sell, choose what they buy. And sustainability is the ability to maintain these other pillars in the long term. So trade touches on availability, access, stability, and sustainability. This is a fundamentally important thing to be looking at. I think there's a good quote from Paul Krugman on this, which is, as the world becomes a more dangerous place, things we take for granted, like large-scale trade and food, may be far more vulnerable than anyone realized. So we're going to start to unpack that. And so what this index is doing is helping us understand the dynamics of bilateral food trade. So what I mean by that is there's been this dramatic increase in the last decade or two of country-to-country level food trade. And these occur outside of the global trade agreements. There's not really a good systems-wide understanding of who's trading with whom, who their plan Bs are, who their plan Cs are, and what happens when you've got multiple shocks in that system. So we need to understand these dynamics to support policy investment and decision-making. And, we've also come to this top image here. This top one here, this dotted line is Australia's wheat production. This is wheat production for all of them. The dotted line is Australia. So we've come to rely on averages, and our global trade system is built on kind of, on average, the variability in different countries. We're going to have this much to import and export. But what happens when multiple food exporters experience non-average years? So if you've got a drought in Ukraine, if you've got a drought in Australia, and you've got floods in the United States, and you've got a heat wave in Canada, what happens? You have multiple, the assumption of the average ceases to hold. So that needs to be looked at too. So what the Jamil Index is going to do is going to look at the climate change impacts on food supply, will help us develop a better understanding of the dynamics of bilateral trade, start to understand what happens as you have multiple shocks to the system, what that does to the ability to pay for imports. So it really is ultimately measuring the vulnerability of the ability to import food. It's going to look at multiple future global change scenarios, so not just climate change, but also economic change, also conflict. So for instance, right now, the Gulf countries of the Middle East, this pointer's not working. The Gulf countries in the Middle East are some of the most food secure countries in the world. Clearly, their climates are not require food importation to meet that level of security. If their economies don't transition away from fossil fuels, then that food security is at risk. We'll also look at regional trade dynamics. So to use this West Asia framing here, you can see on this map, there's these different arrows, and each yellow box kind of highlights different maritime choke points. Using that regional analysis helps to understand what happens if there's for instance, if there's a ship stuck in the Suez Canal, or if there's a conflict on the Black Sea through the Turkish Straits. So that regional analysis is really important. So being able to do this type of analysis at different scales, at the national level, at the subnational level. As a national level, a country may have the wealth and seem food secure, but if there's a region within it which is poor, there's challenges. So this is ultimately what the Jamil Index will do. Couldn't read all my notes, so I actually finished a little early. So I just want to thank everyone. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a bunch of questions on this right after. So our next panelist will be online. So can you see us?
Hello.
Yeah.
Am I audible, visible? So I just start sharing my screen and taking it from there. Okay. Can anyone just? I think I'm audible, visible, and you can see my screen.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Wonderful. Let me just introduce you to the crowd. So Dr. Anirban Kundu is an expert in environmental engineering with a PhD from McGill. He's focusing on bioremediation, smart nanotechnologies, and green hydrogen export. And previously was at Google, where he managed a 30 million innovation climate grant program. He also now volunteers as lead scientist at Conduit Computing and the COP Net Zero, promoting low carbon solutions and public awareness.
Thank you, Vijay. And Really amazing talks till now on the food, agriculture, climate nexus. And I'm just going to dive deep in. And we've all heard this, that agriculture is a bit of a challenging
Hold on,
problems here.
we can't really hear you.
Yeah,
That should be better.
okay.
All right, if you don't mind starting over, that would be great.
Now, maybe?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. So I'll dive deep into, agriculture. It's not easy. There's a lot of challenges, problems, and there's really a need for a sustainable transformation. And we've all heard this in a number of talks before, but a lot of more than 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, land use, deforestation. So what are the science-based drivers when it comes to making agriculture more sustainable? And you can roughly classify them into farming methods, climate resilient agriculture, and improved fertilizer delivery, which is mainly where we worked with nanotechnology. So I'm going to give a brief overview of all these three buckets. So sustainable farming strategies, they've been gaining a lot of prominence in the last 5 to 6 years, mainly in the global south as well, on strategies to keep crop pests in control, improve soil fertility, enable agroecology. And these methods are gaining prominence. They help reduce waste, save water, and really lead to climate resilient food systems. But going beyond, where is the climate resiliency factor coming in and the need for healthier crops? So this is a study from Nature about climate factors like drought, and how drought leads to a bad impact on crop production. So up to 10% drop in crop yields, which really leads to strategies that involve improve crop resilience when it comes to climate extremes, such as drought, extreme heat, low precipitation, and so on. And in addition, fertilizers, and that's where our work at McGill came in. So the global use of fertilizers is growing up by the day. Right now in the world, it's like 200 million tons and above. But if you look at the wastage of N and P, nitrogen and phosphorus, which are the main elements in these fertilizers, more than 60% of the nitrogen and more than 50% of the phosphorus is just wasted. So really, we need innovative methods where we can just supply to the plant, to the crop, exactly the amount of fertilizer that they need. So that leads to lower wastage, it leads to more resource use and efficiency, and the plant, it can get its micro and macronutrients from the fertilizer. So where is the promise of nano in agriculture, right? A number of different use cases, as I'll take you through this journey in the past 10+ years, from genetic engineering to resilient crop strains, as nano sensors on plants, as engineered seed coatings, controlled release of fertilizer, and soil health. Now, for the purpose of time, I'm going to focus on roughly genetic engineering and resilient crop strains, but in more depth in controlled fertilizer release, which is where our collaborative work at McGill came in. But before I go into that, why nano? What's so particularly delightful about nano? Well, one of the material properties is nanoparticles have a very high surface area. If you do the basic surface area to volume ratio, is inversely proportional to the radius. So the smaller your particle, the more is your surface area. And the more is your surface area, it is more chemically reactive, which means you can modify that surface for tailored applications. You might ask me, what tailored applications? Well, to give you a big binding example, targeted drug delivery. Numerous nanoparticles, polymeric hydrogels are being surface modified to attach to specific cells and deliver therapeutics. Hollow nanoparticles, as a second point, they can be used to encapsulate active ingredients. You have drugs, now you have pesticides, nutrients, and the porous shell, when we grow the porous shell around this, the nutrient in the pore, this porous shell leads to the nutrient being delivered over a sustained period of time. So that means that the plant gets the nutrient over a period of time in a slow and steady fashion. And third, being small, nanoparticles can be targeted to specific application areas in the plant. And this is again something that we did at McGill. We published the results about how, by applying it on the leaves, nanoparticles can be tuned to reach the stem and the other areas of the plant and deliver the nutrients. Now, to give you some examples on genetic engineering, so this is a wonderful study in Nature Plants on nanosheets, which we call clay, which is a very earth-abundant nanomaterial, and they encapsulated a type of RNA. And what happened was, when they applied it to plants, they saw that this nanoclay containing the double-stranded RNA had the least number of local lesions, the most healthy plant was in when the plants were dosed with this nanoclay containing this double-stranded RNA virus. And the amount of loading was significantly less than what you would find if you're just loading it using a field applicable or a normal spray method. In terms of stress tolerance, you had cerium oxide nanoparticles that impart salt tolerance on plants. And if you look at the photosynthetic performance metrics, the performance in presence of these cerium nanoparticles are much higher than in the absence or just in terms of normal control experiments. Now, what happens in this whole fertilizer release and delivery? So when we do a conventional fertilizer in the field, you just take a spray can and you spray the fertilizer on the plant. There's a lot of waste because the overall fertilizer that's going to the plant, 100% is never taken up. A lot of it goes down to the soil. There's a pollution on the water, and on the associated, you have leaching, you have a lot of environmental problems that come up. But when you look at nano-enabled strategies, this nano fertilizer, which is the blue is the fertilizer in the nanoparticle, they can be tailored to specific areas in the plant. There is negligible resource waste. It is a specific targeted application, and there is minimal parallel environmental adverse impacts. So let me take you to what we did at McGill. So we worked with zinc, because zinc is a very essential micronutrient in plants. And I synthesized these particles containing a zinc core and a hollow porous silica shell. Now you might be asking, why silica? Well, we want to make particles which have negligible toxicity, and silica is an earth-abundant material. It's already there in the environment. So we guessed if we dose the plant with a minimal amount of these materials, not crossing toxic limits, then that from an operational standpoint is good. And we now want to study the effect that will have on the plant. And how do we understand the application? Well, we do hydroponics in the lab. So we synthesize these particles and we dose them in tomato plants grown in the lab. So what we found was very interesting. If you have a normal fertilizer that initially within a very short span of time, the amount of zinc that's present in the plant rapidly goes up.